In this video, we are going to be covering and explaining the basics and fundamentals of the integumentary system, which is a system that basically revolves around the skin and the functions of the skin. So we're going to cover some of the anatomy and physiology of this very important organ, as well as some accessory organs that aid the skin in producing or making its basic function of protection. So let's begin with a little introduction on the integumentary system. The skin is the largest organ of the body. It has a surface area of over 2 meters, being this a very, very big organ. It accounts for about 7% of your body weight, and the skin serves this major function of protecting the inside of your body. Without the skin, we will fall victim to pathogens, we would automatically lose our body heat, and we probably would die within a couple of minutes. The integumentary system's major organ is the skin. And there are some accessory organs that help the skin do its job, which are hair and nails, as well as some glands that have a function of secreting certain substances in our body. Let's see an overview, an overlook at the components of the skin. We have three major areas, two of them belonging to the skin per se, and another layer that it's an accessory layer to the skin to aid it in its function. So the epidermis, it's made of epithelial cells, and the epidermis is the outermost layer of the skin. We have this layer in here, and it serves the function of the body's shield. This is the first line of defense against pathogens and components on the outside of my body. Directly underneath the skin, we have an area here. Directly underneath the skin, this big area in there called the dermis. This dermis is mostly composed of connective tissue, which is basically where most of the activity of this organ is going to occur. Now, underneath the dermis, we have the hypodermis. This layer, it's not considered a part of the skin, and it anchors the skin to the underlying tissues. It's in there that we can find this layer of adipose tissue or fat that has two major functions of shock absorbing as well as an insulator or protecting against the loss of heat. So now let's start from the surface and move the way in. Let's start talking about what are the cells that make the epidermis. So first, we have a layer called keratinocytes. This is the first or the most superficial type of cells that we can find in the epidermis. The keratinocytes, they have a main function of producing keratin, or the main cells of the epidermis. We have a lot of these keratinocytes. They're basically cells that are dead to this point. They are little bags of keratin and nothing more. Interesting fact about keratinocytes is that every 25 to 45 days, we get a brand new epidermis, and we're going to understand this a little better when we go over how is the functioning of these epidermis, when we look at all the layers of the epidermis. Also, we're going to have something called dendritic cells. These are cells that have a star-shaped, and they have a function of an immunological response. What do we mean by immunological? What we mean is that they serve a purpose in protecting our body against invading pathogens, invading bacteria, invading viruses, anything that is alien to my body. I have these cells that protect me against that. Following these dendritic cells, we have tactile cells. This is what we call Merkel cells, or receptors for touch. So we have cells in our epidermis that allow us to feel sensations through the skin, and those are tactile cells. Following that, we have melanocytes, and melanocytes are a type of cell that is very important. It's very characteristic. We can see the products of these melanocytes pretty evident in everybody. They are spider-shaped cells that synthesize melanin. Now, this is a very important concept, guys. Melanin, it's a pigment. Melanin, it's a color. And this is the color of our skin. And the purpose of this melanin is to protect the cells, the living cells inside of my body against ultraviolet radiation. So as we can see here, there's four different types of cells, even though sometimes we might see the skin as just this layer that it's covering my body, it doesn't just have one basic function. Different cells in this layer of epidermis give this organ the function of protection not only against things on the outside, but many things as well. Let's talk a little bit about some layers of the epidermis. First, we have two different types of skin in the epidermis, depending on the thickness of this layer. We have something called thick skin, and we have something called thin skin. Well, thick skin, as just like the name suggests, it's skin that it's rougher, it's tougher in appearance. And I can find this thick skin in my palms, in my fingertips, and in my foot soles. Basically, everywhere where you have this really, really thick and more rough skin. We have this, and we're going to see it a little bit later when we talk about individually the layers of the epidermis. But what makes thick skin, it's not only the thick layer of cells on top of the skin, but it's the presence of a layer that it's called the stratum lucidum. They just went a little bit over, a little bit everywhere, a little bit everywhere. Here we're back. The stratum lucidum, which is a layer that we can see around this area. Right? This is what the basic characteristic of what makes the skin thick skin, not only the thickness of the cells in there. In the terms of thin skin, this basically covers the rest of your body. So you can find this in your face, chest, back, legs, arms, basically everywhere in our body. And we can see that the first layer of that skin, it's a lot thinner than what it is here in thick skin. But the technical term that makes thin skin is that there is no visible stratum lucidum. This layer, we can't see that layer here in thin skin. So that is an interesting difference between those two layers of the skin. Not only the thickness of the skin, but as well the presence or absence of a layer, a specific layer in the epidermis. So talking about layers of the epidermis, let's go ahead and give a look to the layers, individual layers of the epidermis. The stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and finally stratum basale. These are 5 layers of the epidermis. 4 of them are present in thin skin, and all 5 are present in thick skin. So let's start from the first one and basically get a little bit familiarized with what they do. The main objective of this for our examinations a little bit later is just to remember some basic things that make us able to distinguish between one layer and the other. So let's see. We have the stratum corneum. This is the most external layer of the epidermis. It has about 20 to 30 layers of cells stacked on top of the other, and it serves a function of protection. Basically protection against abrasion and penetration on the skin. It also helps us to prevent some environmental factors, biological or living things wanting to get into my body, chemical substances that might go on top of my skin, and I don't want that inside my body, as well as physical, against things breaking on the skin. So this would be the external layer of the skin. Following that, we have that stratum lucidum, that it's only visible in thick skin. This is just 2 or 3 rows of dead keratinized cells. It's just a layer, and because it looks different under the microscope, we give it a layer. Interesting to notice that both the stratum corneum and the stratum lucidum consist of dead cells. All these cells basically are little bags of keratin that serve as an insulator for the loss of water. Following that, going a little deeper, we have the stratum granulosum. This is where that keratinization process begins. Cells are still alive. They're starting to pile up granules. They're starting to pile up keratin inside the cells. So this is basically where the cells start to die. The nuclei and the organelles start to degenerate. They play a very big part in preventing water loss from my body. Following there, we go to the stratum spinosum. This is several layers. Several layers. Stratum spinosum would be around this area. It's called stratum spinosum because under the microscope, under certain conditions, you can see little spines on the cell membranes of the cell. And if we continue going down, now we go to the deepest layer of the epidermis. We have the stratum basale, which would be the deepest layer. It consists on a single row of stem cells. Guys, what are stem cells? These are cells that are dividing constantly. They are cells that are constantly producing newer cells. When the new cells are being produced, they push the bottom layers towards the surface. And check out how interesting that concept is. So I have a layer that continuously regenerates and it produces new cells all the time, and those cells are being pushed up, pushed up, pushed up. So the different layers of the epidermis, they are not cells that are fixed in place. They are cells that are produced at the stratum basale, and as time passes, they keep migrating toward the surface and they go through the different stages. That would mean that one cell that is produced in the stratum basale will go through all of the layers of the epidermis, through all classifications of the epidermis. So this is like a conveyor belt. This is like a production line more than something that is fixed in place. Now, for the benefit of your study, here I present you with a couple questions that you could do. You could do kind of like test yourself about how our knowledge on the integumentary system is. This is not a part of any required material that would be for class. They would be solely for your benefit. All right, so that basically covers that external layer of the skin, the epidermis. Now let's move to this deeper layer, the dermis, where all the good stuff on the skin is going to happen. So let's see. The dermis, it's basically made of a very, very strong connective tissue. In the dermis, I am going to find a high supply of nerve fibers, blood vessels, and lymphatic vessels. Here in the dermis, we are pretty much alive. It serves a very different purpose than that of the dermis, which is basically that protection emphasis on the skin. Now here we have the organ per se, what is happening, the blood vessels, the nutrients, the reproduction, the sensory reactions, all that good stuff is going to be in there. So the dermis, contrary to the dermis, which consists of 5 layers, the dermis have only 2 layers, and that is the papillary layer as well as the reticular layer. Let's have a look at the papillary layer of the dermis. Here we have the papillary layer. The papillary layer, it's made basically from areolar connective tissue. Very flexible tissue that provides flexible support to the skin per se. In the papillary layer, we can find something called the dermal papillae. And the dermal papillae are peg-like projections in the dermis. And in those folds, imagine them as waves in the ocean. In those folds, we're going to find something called the Meissner corpuscles. Meissner corpuscles are special sensory components that allows me to feel touch. So through the epidermis, I can feel touch. Also in this dermal papillae, we're going to find something really interesting for us. Friction ridges. This is formed from overlaying layers. It's if we imagine this dermal papillae going up and down, it forms this overlaying waves over the epidermis, which result in our fingerprints. And as we all know, fingerprints are genetically unique, and they serve a purpose of increased grip. Now, this is increased grip. It's an evolutionary feature of the human being because we constantly use our hands for grabbing things and the soles of our feet for running or finding food. So it's very interesting to find this this genetically unique feature that we have in there. And this is the most superficial layer of the dermis. So if you want to see where is it's this fingerprints coming from, all of that is written down in our genes, and directly below the epidermis, the very first thing that the dermis is going to form would be this friction ridges. Very interesting in there. Let's move a little deeper into the dermis and let's talk about the reticular layer. Now we're a little bit deeper into the dermis. We're kind of like getting to getting to the very, very deep portions of the skin. The reticular layer, it's the deepest level of the epidermis. It's made of dense, irregular connective tissue. So here we have more of a function of connecting. In the reticular layer, there is a interesting concept here called cleavage or tension lines, which is that for some reason there is less dense regions of the dermis that run longitudinally through the skin. And interesting is that surgeons use this cleavage lines for making incisions because they show better healing on cuts on that area, which is kind of like interesting. Also, flexure lines are thermal folds near the joints, and we can easily see this flexure lines. These are originated really deep in the skin. They are examples on the palms, on the fingers, and on the soles of our feet. So kind of like very interesting what we have in this area here of the dermis. So here again we have a little bit of practice for a little bit of practice on questions that you can focus on that we can use later for our quiz or we could use later for our test. Well, everyone, with this, we're going to wrap the first part of this video. In this first part, we covered basically the anatomy of the skin, what is the layers of the skin, the epidermis, what layers are there, the dermis, and what layers are there. On the next video, we're going to start talking a little bit more about those accessory structures of the skin that aid the skin in doing all of those interesting functions that the skin is going to do. So guys, take care and see you on the next one.